welcome to my channel. My name is Ashley. I make lifestyle, book, travel, education, college type of videos, and if you want to follow me along, you can subscribe. I am so happy because I've reached 93 subscribers, and today is going to be another book video. I read a lot of books. I just burped. My whole thing is I want to make education more accessible because I do come from the position that I go to an Ivy League school and I have access to a bunch of resources, but I think to be an English major is none of those things. You know, yes, it is important to discuss with people, but sometimes just even looking these authors up on YouTube or even Wikipedia or hearing what other people on Reddit have to say is like still a way out of school session to be a part of a literary conversation. So I'm going to pile them up here and we'll watch the pile grow. Okay, these are all of the books that I read. There are 13 of them for roughly 13 weeks of summer. 13 is my favorite number, but I'll also be talking about a 14th one that I'm currently working on. And I'm going to go in order of oldest books, so the books I read first, to my most current reads. What I will say about this reading list is that it was genuinely phenomenal and life-changing. All the books were personally enriching. Maybe it's the point of life that I'm currently at, but I just could not recommend some of these books more, and I'm really excited for you guys to hear about them. So the first book that I read was highly anticipated. It's called Time is a Mother, and it was a beautiful book of poems, but I will definitely say that if you want to read Vuong, I would definitely recommend his other book of poems or even his novel On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. It felt like this one he had kind of fallen into the pressures of being a writer and having to put out good literature, in the fact that sometimes his ideas were too abstract and I felt like he was getting lost, and it felt like he had less time to dwell on this collection. There was maybe 3 or 4 that were standout, but because he's such a notable author, they're published on other places like Poetry Foundation, poets.org. A lot of times he was speaking to a very slim, extremely highly educated audience in the different things that he was referencing. I would say most of his poems focused on a friend he had, his mother, and the idea of language. The second book I read was Mrs. Dalloway, and it is a very interesting book. And Mrs. Dalloway is about a woman who is throwing a dinner party and how her story intersects with a psychologically unwell man, his family, and his own sense of trauma, because if I remember correctly, he was a veteran of a particular war. And like any Virginia Woolf novel, it was extremely stream of conscious. It developed and sort of weaved in and out of these different characters' monologues and thought process, and it was kind of a critique on class when you're trying to create dissonance between two things, like something like class or any big gap that society has, where sometimes it comes across like a critique and sometimes it just comes across tone deaf. To be honest, I think her half read maybe as more tone deaf, and it was about the experience of things secondhand and also like how we compartmentalize and synthesize and reevaluate the past once we're brought to a future, and how that influences what we see in the present. It definitely was not my favorite Woolf novel. I would definitely say if you want to read Virginia Woolf, I would read A Room of One's Own, To the Lighthouse. I just saw it as a very like mundane, momentary character study, and then it's kind of over. Love by Toni Morrison. Now when I read Morrison's, I'm kind of comparing her against herself, which feels more fair than comparing her against everyone per se. So basically, I'll just give a summary. This book is about these two girls who were friends growing up and sort of how they were wildly changed by the fact that one of the girls married the other girl's grandfather. So true to Toni Morrison, already there was like this extremely big, pervasive concept of like child's predatoriness And I think it does a great job of showing that they're both the victims, right? Because the man dies and now one child is literally the heir of another girl's birthright almost. Also, like any Toni Morrison novel, it has a huge focus on the female commune, what happens when only women live in the same house together, and how does that sort of subsist normal patriarchal standards of how we view living together, community, etc. And it was very interesting because in this particular commune, as opposed to the commune in, for instance, Paradise, it's seen as less pure, less holy. There's so much tension in the ways that they hate each other. The foundation of it is limited resources for women, the whole system of things being inherited, and how do you steal other people's right to live and to succeed, and how much of that is dependent on a man, and just stuff like that. And so I think in a certain way this book is extraordinarily beautiful. I can also see why it was less famous though, because it took place in this very concentrated place of their own heads and this one house and their own hatred, and versus I feel like books like Beloved or Song of Solomon have a more complete picture of society and human interaction. But I still thought that this book was beautiful and definitely worth reading. The fourth book I read is this one, Fun Home, and in my collection I think I have two books that are considered currently banned books. It's a very, very dark book. She is just trying to come to terms with the fact that her dad committed suicide and that he wasn't a good person, and in like a very East of Eden way. There was a blood tie. So how can I still take responsibility feeling like I was dealt a bad hand psychologically and childhood-wise? Even though she feels so ostracized from the town that she grew up in Pennsylvania, where her father and her mother and her mother's mother and her father's father, actually I just think it's her father's side, all grew up in the same block neighborhood in Pennsylvania. Her father, she later learned, got in lots of trouble. He was preying on young teenage boys, and so Alison Bechdel, this is a autobiography, finds out that her father slept with her babysitter, slept with his students as an English teacher, and not like these were consensual relationships, but a lot of them were predatory. It's so beautiful, but one thing I will say about this book, and the reason why I didn't like it that much, even though I think that it should never be banned and it is a beautiful book, is that it gave me so much OCD. I felt like every time, as a way of understanding her own life, she just kind of almost like copy pasted her own life into very famous literary books. And not only did I feel like it diminished her own life, but it also felt like she was trying to find almost a science or a math out of literature that didn't exist. I will say, in order to read this, she uses a vocabulary like I have never seen before, almost in like a bad way. Like I had not had to look up this many words since like I was in 7th grade. It felt like when I was like in 7th grade trying to like read the New York Times or like Dickens. It was like insane. The next book is Open Water by Azumah Nelson. I actually came across this. This isn't why I read this book. I read it because it was discounted at the bookstore, but it was on Jack Edwards' 20 books you should read in your 20s. And even though it wasn't my favorite book out of this list or even like a top tier book, I definitely agree with him in that I don't think you have to have any understanding or even love of literature. I think it's just such a beautiful modern love story that is YA, but it also has so much nuance to it. It's like one of those books where it's fiction, but you can tell that it imbues part of the own writer's personality and life experiences, because he dwells a lot on his love for basketball and his love for photography that I feel like any passionate individual could also share. And the way that he talked, you know, because he wasn't a writer, it did feel cliche at times, but in a way where it was just so honest that I didn't care that it was cliche. I didn't care that it was a love story, because you find yourself rooting for them. And you also find yourself, you know, in your 20s, you grow up and you realize that love isn't enough to succeed. In this book, spoiler, his friend dies because of racial injustice, violence on the street, and that sort of brings their life apart. He isn't able to talk with his girlfriend as openly and honestly. And I also really liked that the way that they got together wasn't necessarily the most pure or the most like book book pure almost. She was originally his best friend's girlfriend, and so there was that layer, and like this layer of being misunderstood because they both went to this very posh private school. And so it felt like you were really getting a part of this special world that was messy, that was real, that was extremely intimate. It was just a raw, emotional, beautiful book that I can see why was so successful. And then we come to literally the love of my life. I read this in a plane. I should preface, this is The Idiot by Elif Batuman. And I am one of those people who, growing up, I literally thought that I could not laugh because I thought that laughing was like a societally engineered, I was like a really weird kid. I thought that laughing was like an engineered thing that people did, and so I always forced myself to laugh. But this fucking book, okay, it was like 2 a.m. in a plane. Everyone around me was sleeping, and I felt so bad because I kept on laughing. This book is fucking hilarious, and in the most beautiful and in a way that so resonated with me, because so basically the main character, her name is Celine, she goes to Harvard, she studies comparative literature and Russian. A lot of it is a book about linguistics and the nuances of linguistics, almost like the humor of it, and how she views being a bilingual and now trilingual student. But the reason why I loved it is because I go to Columbia, and going to Columbia, I was like, are people missing something? Because I think this experience is highly ironic. People are caricatures of themselves. How do they not understand that them being a socialist with $1 billion is funny as fuck? The entire like categorization and pedestalization of language and people and things and historical moments and just knowledge is just absurd, ironic, crazy, punny. And this is just a book where you can just fall in love with a character, with their thought. You can root for them while also finding them so funny and so awkward and like almost a delightful coming of age way. The next book was gifted to me by my lovely friend Iris, Seek You, A Journey Through American Loneliness by Kristen Radtke. And it's interesting because I don't think she's super popular, or this book is that popular within the world of graphic novels. And I think the reason for that is that I turn to a good page is like the actual construction of the art is not my favorite. But I was just like, it felt a little bit, I won't say lazy because it is a lot of work to do one of these. The writing itself was decent to actually very good. I think that one of my favorite ways that graphic novels can be used is like they're really great for jabby punchlines and quick quips. Or what I really loved about this book though was the stories, and not even just the personal stories, but it was the interweaving of historical stories, science, and psychology. So a lot of it was just the story of Harry Harlow's experiments, also his love life, and the extreme sense of isolation he felt. In fact, one of the reasons why he did this experiment was with monkeys was because he felt extremely depressed. He ended up torturing them, but it benefited the world, it benefited mankind. His research went on to win awards and change the way that we perceive interaction with our loved ones, our kids, etc. But it came out of a place of personal torture for him and inflicted torture onto the people around him. It also had a lot to do with how loneliness as a woman is perceived differently than the loneliness as a man. She draws to examples from famous TV shows like Friends and Mad Men in a way that felt extremely accessible. Loneliness almost as a intergenerational language. She starts with the anecdote that her father is obsessed with CQ calls, and how years later does she realize that this is his own form of coping with loneliness. How can I understand my own loneliness through the eyes of my parents, through the eyes of the media that I am consuming, and the knowledge that I'm learning? This book, which I did not like. So this is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess. Basically in the foreword, he is a conceited little fuck. He's like, oh, my publishers just didn't understand me. The foreword to this piece is basically that his publishers made him cut out a part of the story where the main character could be redeemed, when in actuality it was his publisher who encouraged him to write the final chapter. And the reason why the final chapter has a lot of significance is because up until the final chapter, it's literally just pure fucking violence and mayhem, and it's a banned book, and I don't think that language should ever be censored. So this is not me saying that, you know, it's a bad book, it should be banned, but this book is just disgusting. The author cites the publication of this book as a way for him to deal with the rape of his wife, which I'm sorry, but no, it's not yours to deal with almost, or like, it is yours to deal with, sir, but not like this. I mean, just the amount of times that women are raped in this book, the amount of unnecessary violence, his writing fucking sucks, and he hides it behind the fact that he just uses this random ass vocabulary that I had to go on Wikipedia to find what any of these words meant. The fact that he lied about how it was published, all of it seemed to be like a call for like, oh, look at me being some literary icon, I'm throwing a man in the woods, I'm talking about social injustice, and I'm like, no, clearly you wrote this book so you could get a kick out of violence. Read it, but if you feel uncomfortable or just plain out don't like this book, that's okay. I don't think that it should be banned for the fact that it includes violence and rape. I mean, read a Toni Morrison novel. It doesn't feel like it's written by some white man pretending to cope with shit and clearly just like fucking talking about young girls' breasts. So that's this book. The 8th book that I read was Calypso by David Sedaris. I had heard about this book a while back. I knew something about David Sedaris, mainly just his name. I loved this book. It was very feel good. He's also funny, but not in like a laugh out loud way, more in like a subtle dad chuckle kind of way. And he talks about his different relationships with his family, particularly his dead sister, but also his older sister, Amy Sedaris, who is very famous. He talks about his little beach house and his life with his lover. And he talks about kind of interesting things, what he does on book tours, his shopping addiction. And so it's just a very good, feel good, but not even that feel good. Like there's an element of like a lot of thought and a lot of awareness, almost like reevaluating and finding joy and irony in more smaller moments of life, while also dealing with bigger problems like his own health and his own sister's death. I liked that it was a compilation of a bunch of different essays. They were educational, they were cute, fun, witty, and interesting. Elif Batuman's second novel, the prequel to the book that I spoke very gloatingly about earlier. It's definitely a more mature book than The Idiot, and in The Idiot, I think it's a lot about finding yourself in college, your initial disdain for what people find interesting, parties, hookup culture, stuff like that, and this is her more buying into the idea of being like everyone else and more traveled. She's kind of had her first sort of infatuation in college, and she's also kind of more resigned to the idea of being told things through her education at Harvard and accepting them as truth. So this book is definitely more brain heavy. It's very focused on her interiority and sort of her academic and epistemological struggles, but basically either or is about her experience finding a book that says you can either live an aesthetic life or an ethical life. And her friend tells her, Celine, you are an aesthetic striving person because of your obsession with how things sound, your obsession with learning different languages, how you don't want to get married, and how you sort of throw yourself at these ideas of love. But Celine struggles with the idea that her friend tells her that her life is inherently not ethical. So she questions, well, why is following all these societal rules, why is not taking risks, stuff like that, considered ethical, but her own life considered aesthetic? It does a beautiful job of trying to struggle with what it means to be a sophomore in college, feel like you're at the precipice of becoming something, but in order to do that, it takes a choice that can lead you one way or another way. It's a little more emo and I think true to sophomore year than sort of the wide-eyed, funny freshman year self that Celine was. The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, a widely popular book with over 1 million copies sold. This book is hard because I initially loved it. It is about a lot of super deep issues like domestic violence, sexism, and queer relationships. And I think in that way, what the book strives to do is a gorgeous thing. And Evelyn Hugo, she's a gorgeous woman, and obviously she's had some husbands, but she is LGBTQ and her greatest love in her life, she claims, is a woman. My one gripe with this book that becomes apparent both on the forums that I read while I was personally trying to grapple and understand this book, my main problem is that we are giving a straight white woman a voice. The narration is through a mixed race girl talking about a queer woman. So I think just so many parts of the nuances were lost. For instance, I think that her relationship, Evelyn Hugo's relationship with a woman, was extremely steeped in misogyny, sexism, the ways that in order for us as a reader to think that this book is popular, have it be widely loved, it has to be through the mouth of a straight white woman, and it has to be the depiction of someone who could have 7 husbands, who could be the most gorgeous person on the planet. And maybe in some ways that's that is how the world works, is we live in a sexist society where maybe that is the truth and the nature of these sort of interactions, but it just felt like there was this obsession with the fact that almost like it's like a anomaly that queer women can be beautiful, that mixed race women can be beautiful, successful, when the author herself is a straight white woman. It was a beautiful book, and it was thrilling and enthralling, and it kept your attention, and I think I read it in like 2 days. I read online that she felt like she had to raise other people's platform, and I don't think that's wrong, but I just wonder, internally, well, why is someone else with that platform being ignored? This fucking masterpiece, Crying in HMart by Zauner. Oh my gosh, after I read this book, I was completely just watching so many Zauner interviews, watching her Vogue 7 looks in 7 days. An Asian talking about the grief of losing a mother in just such a beautiful and real way that it didn't feel like it was trauma dumping. It didn't feel like it was tokenizing anything. I felt like she was just so real and so honest and so true to who she was as a writer, as a musician. A huge theme of it is food, and I think in Asian culture, food is such a love language, and how her mother's arrival of her death kind of speeds up her own obsession with holding on to these parts of her mother that feels like she has to access before her mother dies. Her own sense of grief that, her mother will never be the one to teach her cooking. Even, after she moves on with her life and moves back to New York and finds success in her career, she still takes the time to spend hours and hours making kimchi. Just resonances that I could see in the people around me, and little things, and things like going to the grocery market, and also how she reflects on her own teenage angst, not in a way where she's mad at herself for almost breaking the bond that she has with her mother, but realizing that her and her mother have these very cultural but very stubborn and ingrained tendencies of fighting for themselves, fighting for their survival. And you just feel this girl's, and Zauner, she's not a girl, she's a badass woman. You feel her intimate relationship with her mother through just the smallest things, words, conversations, hair, food, travel. Also, it does a good job of being angry, reacting to grief in a way that maybe isn't so glamorous. Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake. This book is like a classic to me. I think that it's beautiful in the way that classics are, in that it hits on so many themes. The main character, Gogol Ganguly, he later changes his name, which is how it's called, The Namesake, to Nikhil Ganguly, but it just follows his own parents' journey to America, the sort of trials that they went through, his own trials, his eventual marriage and relationship with his sister, his mother, family problems that happen related to health. I don't want to completely give this book away. There are so many beautiful moments, the ways that she is able to capture each parent's own griefs about coming to America. The dad's sort of oh, how am I gonna have this child after something really traumatic happens to him, and his mother, even though she can speak the language, America is so different and she feels so far from her family. As Gogol is growing up, there are points where he just adores his parents, he adores his name, he adores his heritage, and then there are points where he pulls away. How is he able to understand his parents better, understand his name better? Why is his mother the way she is? He's growing up into this very rigid family structure of how people should be married, how food should be eaten, how parties and marriages and everything should be celebrated. And then he finally realizes, wow, this is why the way my parents are the way they are. Now I appreciate that. Honestly, probably one of my top 5 books I've ever read. I really just wanted to mention this book. It's Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend, and Elena Ferrante is a pseudonym. This was translated from Italian. It's a beautiful book. I mean, I don't even know how to praise it enough. This video, I'm going to have to edit it because it is 1 hour and 7 minutes. I fucking love talking about books. But this, The Namesake could be a classic, but this will, in my opinion, be a classic. I mean, it has all of the elements. I'm only halfway through. That this like feels like reading 100 Years of Solitude or something that just like is like a chronicle of an entire town. And it talks about violence and how we are assimilated to culture and education. You know, her friend is like, 12, and someone tells her, well, like, this guy, he's a little fascist, and this guy's a communist, and this guy killed, and how we're exposed to like these huge world concepts that in a kid's brain logistically doesn't make sense yet. How we're introduced to politics, how we're introduced with wealth. Like, so it's kind of like about rivalry, both like her and her friend, but also realizing like the huge scheme of like what rivalry is, what is like citizenship in this town look like, how am I supposed to behave? And I think a huge theme of it is the main character's best friend's resentment with how people are so resigned to this way and this style of life that as a kid makes no sense to her. It feels arbitrary, but it dominates everywhere. I think this book is amazing. Okay, so these are the 14 books that I read in a little under 14 weeks. I like to end all my videos with like a little heart-to-heart about why I read. You need to read, which you don't. But I don't know if I have time for that. Like, I feel like I'm gonna really be fucking over my editor self. I love these books. I think there is a common myth that books improve your mental health and your status of education, and I mean, I don't think that's untrue. Mental health, I sometimes think that reading is like shit for my mental health, but I choose like extremely dark books that aren't like how to obtain happiness. So what I will say is that reading books is a way for me to not feel lonely. I think a lot of times with movies, because you're watching things like third person, you don't feel as connected to the characters, and what I love about books is that you can sort of like read what characters are thinking. You have access to their interiority, and in some way that brings me some sense of comfort. And also because of the format of a book, you are able to explore and be a part of more mundane moments, whereas I feel like in movies sometimes there's just so much action and it's hard to sort of like parse through what's happening, what people are thinking. I'll be the first to admit I did not read a book a week in that way. Sometimes I went a week without reading a book, if my job was starting or if I had a lot to cope with personally. And sometimes, as a way of coping, I just read a book in a day or in 2 days. And not very healthily, like staying up until 2 a.m. I want to create a literary internet platform where I can read from a diverse source of authors and give my takes and be able to present various perspectives and etc. But obviously I'm just one person. Of course you can shit on my opinions. I think that's the beauty of, even for myself, getting to the point where I can read enough literature. One of these super formative experiences I had growing up was I hated the way that we read To Kill a Mockingbird and how it was taught. What we saw as a cornerstone of understanding race relations and incarceration and justice was again through the lens of a white woman. Huge reason why I read so much is because, it's one thing to insult an author, but clearly I can't create something better, so it's about finding alternatives. Being able to come across an author like Toni Morrison, who would have been a great, replacement for the teaching of To Kill a Mockingbird, recognizing what stands, what is revolutionary for its time, what are the backstories for certain works of art such as A Clockwork Orange. Let's re-examine the lies and the, reasoning and culture around this book itself. And my job and what I hope to do as a curious YouTuber, you know, is trying to take my English studies as far as possible, is to give you just a sense of who I am, what I read, what I love, and I hope that in sharing this passion with you, you can resonate, you can form your own opinion. I just wanted to thank you so much for watching this video and supporting me. I cannot believe that I have 93 subscribers. I appreciate every single view, comment, just anything so much. I will see you guys next time, and I hope you learned something.